everybody. Welcome to the Teaching Kitchen at New York-Presbyterian Hudson Valley Hospital. My name is Chef Emily, and today we have our guest of honor, Paul Butler, who's the coordinator of the New York-Presbyterian Hudson Valley Hospital's Chaplin program. And I invited him here to discuss really what are some of the best ways to offer support and comfort, whether it's for yourself or someone else, but also because I had the great privilege of participating in a workshop that Paul ran it's called The Body Knows. Is that correct?
The Body Knows, correct.
Body Knows. And it was such a powerful and impactful workshop. And I just thought I really want this to be shared with our community as well. So we're here around the kitchen table, around the virtual kitchen table. And the way this program will run, it's a little bit longer than usual because I really wanted to give Paul time to walk us through this. And we're going to be making two recipes. We're going to be making a Parmesan chicken recipe and a roasted tomatoes and cauliflower dish. And I like these because they just both go into the oven, and then Paul will lead us through the workshop. So that's kind of how today's class will run. It's a little bit of a different format than some of you may be used to. We have Alita, who's moderating our panel tonight, our class. And so Alita will be reading from the chat box if we have questions coming in for myself or Paul. And to all of you out there who are around your own kitchen tables, I'm so grateful that you're joining us this evening. It's really an honor to be on your screens. So with that, Paul, if you want to just spend a few minutes telling us a little bit about what you have in store for class today, and I'll jump into some cooking, and then you'll lead us off in the workshop.
Sure, I'd love to. Again, thank you for Emily for allowing me to be a partner in this. And thanks for Alita for kind of making sure that everybody has a voice. Because that's one of the biggest things that we're trying to do when we talk about being around the table is how do we not only share our voice and share our experiences, but often how do our experiences live in us? Emily had mentioned the sense of the body knows. The body knows was part of a continued look at resiliency. In the past 18 months, and as we continue to move forward, we constantly have to look at how do we practice resiliency. And the body knows was trying to capture this reality that we literally hold on to our past experiences. Some of you might be familiar with the acronym PTSD. I often tell people that post-traumatic stress is not a disorder. It's an experience. And we have those experiences where we go through something and it has a deep and lasting effect. And that in of itself isn't the problem. The problem occurs when every single time that we either are somehow adjacent to an experience like that, or we are thinking of that experience, that we end up reliving it. And the whole goal is to be able to talk about experiences and not relive them. Ultimately, and this is kind of the golden rule, particularly for being around the kitchen table, is how do we experience our own kitchen tables, our own experiences, and we're left better than when we started, right? There's nothing better than having a great meal. And after we're done, we're like, wow, that was phenomenal. And there's nothing worse than having a horrible meal and saying, wow, I'm never going back there again. So the whole idea is, how do we have an experience where we end up leaving better than we started?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a beautiful introduction to this. And the culinary school that I went to was a little bit out there in some of its philosophies, but we learned what one of my teachers taught us, biography becomes biology. So I really loved that phrase, and it stuck with me all these years later. Biography becomes biology. The stories that we live through and the experiences that we have and the stories that we tell ourselves about the experiences that we have, right? They actually become our biology. So I think that was very sort of an awakening moment for me. So I'm going to shift the camera just to the cutting board so we can quickly get these things in the oven. And the purpose of, these recipes is, I want to be able to, get dinner on the table in 45 minutes and have it be a fairly complete meal that everybody's going to love. So that's really the goal with these recipes. So the oven is on, it's hot, and we're just going to toss everything right in. We're starting with a red onion, and we're going to make roasted vegetables. Now, I'm using, I have my trash bin over there. I promise I'm not just discarding things into the abyss. And I'm using a mix of both summer produce and fall produce. I have cauliflower here, which is definitely more of a fall produce, and some tomatoes, which you can still find this time of year, kind of end of summer. This is really their last moment. So I like this recipe because it's kind of on the cusp of both seasons, and the flavors actually work really, really well together. So I'm just slicing this onion into pretty thick slices. I would say they're each about a quarter to even half an inch thick. And I'm going to try not to cry too much. I'm putting it on a parchment lined baking sheet. This is my cauliflower. I used half of it for soup earlier today, so we're just going to pretend it's still whole cauliflower. If this were whole cauliflower, I would just put it on its head and I would cut out the core with a knife, kind of wedge it out. The core is a bit tough, so you don't really want that in your veggies. I mean, certainly you could make some use of it. Some people will keep it, or I just will put it in the compost. But you can either keep it and roast it separately on its own sheet, on its own tray, because it takes a little bit longer. Or you can grate it and steam it. And, just have it like grated and steamed cauliflower, which sometimes I add to smoothies because you basically can't taste it. So there are other ways to use up the stem. And if anyone has suggestions on how to use cauliflower stem, we always love to hear from our audience. I'm going to create a diving board so these can just dive right onto the tray. And again, we're doing this quickly because we want to make sure that you have time to spend, with whoever's around your kitchen table, right? So we've got some tomatoes, going to roughly chop those. And then this is going to get a couple cloves of garlic smashed on there. Very, very simple, olive oil and salt. And then roasted for about 45 minutes until things really start to soften. Halfway through the roasting, and this is important, you don't want to miss this step, you're going to add some white wine. So we've got all of our veggies here. Now, you don't want them lumped up in the middle like I do. You want to spread them out. So spread them out so they're kind of more or less in an even layer, and you've got tomatoes and cauliflower kind of everywhere. Then you're going to add your olive oil, a quick squeeze bottle, a pinch of salt, and go from up high so it distributes everywhere. And then just crack a couple of garlic cloves. You don't have to add the garlic cloves. Oh, these are very tough. You don't want to go in. But this is a garlic from our garden. We have an organic garden. For those of you that are new to our teaching kitchen, welcome. We have an organic garden on site. We're very fortunate that we take care of with some of our local volunteers here. So just a little rough chop on that garlic. And let's put that in the oven. The oven is hot, so that's really important. You want your oven to be hot before that goes in, right? So roasted vegetables are great because you can they're a really passive way to cook. As you can tell, everything just kind of goes in, and then you can go off and set the table and light your candles or do whatever else you need to do to create a really nice ambiance. This is our white wine for later. Don't let me forget that in 20 minutes. And then we have a little bit of white balsamic vinegar that's going to go on at the end. The next recipe is just as easy. It takes a little bit more like forethought because you do have to marinate that chicken for a little bit. But it only takes, it's like a 30-minute marinade. And look, if you can't do it and you don't have the time, you can skip it. It's absolutely fine. You want to prepare sort of like a station for yourself. I'm going to use this pie pan because I kind of want to nest the chicken in here. And I'm using chicken thighs. So I have some grated Parmesan cheese. I just grated it on the large holes of the box grater, just like this. And I always tell people this is like tiny knives. So be careful when you're doing this. It's always a good task to give someone though. If anybody wants to help out in the kitchen, like grate the cheese, right? Everybody can kind of do that. If they're too small to hold a knife, they can carefully grate the cheese. Okay, we're gonna add some eggs to one bowl. And the recipe calls for 3 eggs. I'm not doing as many chicken thighs, so I don't think I'm gonna need as many eggs. So I'm just gonna start with 2. I've got the chicken marinating here in some garlic, olive oil, and salt. And then in this bowl, we're gonna set up our breadcrumbs. So you can do breadcrumbs. You can also do almond meal is nice if you are gluten-free. They also sell gluten-free breadcrumbs, so that's pretty convenient as well. Okay, so we're gonna chop up some parsley. If you wanted to use dried parsley flakes, that's a pretty quick hack as well if you didn't have the fresh parsley. And let me just make sure I'm combining everything in the right places. So we've got the eggs in one bowl. We've got the breadcrumbs in here. We're gonna add the parsley, chop that up really nice and small. And then we're gonna toss in some Parmesan cheese. I think it's about a cup. Yes, exactly, 1 cup. It's been a while since I made this. But again, it's a nice dish. I'm discarding the really thick stems, but everything else can go in. It's a nice dish because it's kind of a no hassle dish. You wanna cut this up pretty small. Pop that in with the breadcrumbs. Here's our cheese, about a cup of that. Nice handful, it's about a cup. Let's mix that all together. Let's see, did we forget anything? We've got the breadcrumbs, the parsley, the Parmesan, the garlic went in with the chicken while it was marinating. And then this is gonna be kind of our delicious breadcrumby mixture. Now, it's useful to have a pair of gloves if you do like a pair of disposable gloves when you're working with chicken, or you can, carefully wash your hands, which is what I do at home because I don't always have these gloves at home. But yeah, just always be careful when you're working with chicken of any cross-contamination. You really don't want to mix the raw chicken with your vegetables or anything like that. So create a little flow for yourself. I'm gonna add a little drizzle of olive oil to the bottom of my dish. And we're just gonna go right across. You're gonna wanna beat the eggs. So grab a fork or a whisk or whatever is convenient. Mix that up. We're kind of gonna go 1, 2, 3. So at the end, you're gonna notice I'm gonna roll these. So they're gonna kind of like tuck in under and nestle into the dish. Right, so here's our chicken, into the egg, into the bread. You probably do these a few at a time. And then you're just gonna discard, the garlic and olive oil stuff that you have there. You don't really need it. So coat that really well. Then you can see it's kind of, this is a boneless, skinless chicken thigh. It's kind of like a long piece. So then you can roll it, tuck it, and just pop it in the pie dish. So I'm using this pie dish because again, you don't want these to, you kind of want these to be like, nested in next to each other. You don't want them to be too spread out. Any questions about this recipe so far, or the roasted veggies that are already on their way in the oven? Yeah, Alita, what do
almost done. So there's a question from Tina. Could you use regular balsamic or white vinegar in the veggies?
Yeah, so I'm using white balsamic, but could you use regular balsamic? Yeah, absolutely. The difference is more, it's not so much flavor and more for color. The dark balsamic will kind of make the, make them look a little muddy. But I have no problem with that. If that's what you have and that's what's convenient, I always am an advocate for just using what you have on hand. So any kind of vinegar will work pretty well with that recipe. Apple cider vinegar, I wouldn't use like household white vinegar only because it doesn't have a lot of personality. And I like my vinegars to have a little more personality, I think.
And Denise wants to know, how would you make this recipe if you decide to use chicken breast instead of the thigh meat?
You would do it exactly the same way, Denise. It just might cook a little bit faster. Yeah, good question. You might want to, because chicken breast can be a bit thick, you might want to pound the chicken breast so it's a little bit thinner. So you could, I'll tell you how I do that in a second. I just want to show you, this is what it looks like before it goes in. Okay, so in it goes. And now you can go put your feet up, do what you need to do before everybody's crowded around your table. So if you're working with chicken breasts, I would take, like a mallet or something that you could make it a little bit thinner. Put like 2 sheets of saran wrap down, or I usually use like saran wrap just to make sure the chicken doesn't go everywhere. So saran wrap, chicken breast, saran wrap on top, and then you get your mallet and you pound it so that it's one thin, even layer, and it's the same, it's the same thickness like throughout the whole thing. And then you would roll them up and do it that way. Okay. Any other questions about our recipe?
Not at this point, Chef Emily.
Okay, so you see how easy both of those were. So this is something you can have dinner on the table, and it takes about 40 to 45 minutes, but it's very, very passive. It's not a lot of dishes, it's not a lot of cleanup. So with that, Paul, I'm ready to turn it back over to you. So let's see if I can now spotlight your video. So, okay. All right, there we go.
So Emily, when you connected with the cooking, when you marinate something, does it really matter if you marinate it overnight versus a few hours, or is there a saturation point?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, actually, because it really depends on what you're marinating it in. So for example, if you're marinating salmon, you actually don't want to marinate it for too long because the acids and the salts of the marinade will start to toughen and break the fish down in ways that aren't really great for cooking. So the meat, like the flesh, will lose some of its integrity. So there is such a thing as over marinating. Usually that can be, with fish, can be over marinated. But when it comes to chicken, I would say like a 30-minute marinade is good, and then an overnight marinade is great. But not everybody can, always do that. Is there like an oversaturation point? Yeah, I would say like a marinade for more than 3 days might be a bit much. Yeah. Good question.
Sure, I just use that because I'm kind of using it as part of the kind of the metaphor of this sense of going back to experiences. And there are those experiences that are fresh and that are right there. And then there are those other ones that seem that they've really kind of saturated us. And maybe in some ways they've been over marinated, and we just haven't been able to figure out how do we get them out so that they can have almost a fresh sense. When we were talking about the body nose, and I was very fortunate. Tanya In-Law, who's the director of volunteer services, we had hooked up with some other chaplains throughout the different campuses for NYP, and got connected with this idea of the body nose, with the underlying idea that we hold stress, and that's what I was trying to hint at before. And we go through this process of kind of walking through different questions where one person is interviewed and the other person asks the questions, and the topics can vary. But the idea is that we can have this conversation, and while we're having this conversation, the underlying principle is that what we're trying to do is to honor the story. Ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to honor that person's story. It's not about fixing it. And that sometimes is difficult for people to not only hear, but it's difficult for people to do. We're literally talking about being around the kitchen, and a kitchen is often about doing things, right? We have to do things, we have to get things prepared. That's all well and good and incredibly important. But as Emily was noting before, part of the reason why we eat is not just so that we can sustain ourselves. I mean, that's a minimal part of it. But there's such a depth in that cooking invites us into, to be able to sit and to allow a meal to, as to use that phrase that you had from culinary school, to allow our biology to be more than just digesting food. When we're going to digest stories. And the body says this: we can listen to a person's story, and we can honor that story, and we can walk through that story in a way that allows the person to hear what they're saying, and to allow that person to have a space where that story becomes, in this real gifted sense, a sacred story, an honored story. We were using it in the cases of people going through any sort of trauma connected with COVID. That was kind of the background. But then as we began to kind of use it and look at it, we saw that it can be used in multiple situations. There's always the old adage, and I say, I don't know if it's adage or wisdom. Sometimes it's both, right? The things that you're not supposed to talk at parties, right? Politics and religion, right? That's what they say. But then we know, like within the last 18 months, sometimes there's nothing else to talk about except for things, because things are so interrelated. Things are so interconnected. And because of that, I think we need to have a strategy to be able to, rather than say, well, let's just look at the paint on the wall and see how nice that paint is. So I just want to offer, just for a second, to first and foremost, if people are questioning, how do I get into this? How do I do this? First and foremost, it's about recognizing that we are a people of the body, and we're a people of the spirit. And we can settle ourselves through breathing, through literally slowing us down. Emily gave us that beautiful sense of, like, okay, let's get the food going, let's get this set up, let's go. And now it's in. Now we can kind of rest for a second. And that's what a good metaphor of looking at. So I just invite everybody's on this call. The food's in there, it's cooking. Emily's going to monitor it, so we don't have to worry about any of that. If you have your own food cooking right now, hopefully you can kind of let it sit. And just kind of take a moment to breathe in and breathe out. It's always interesting that once we put an emphasis on something that is so important, it gains new meaning. Throughout our lives, we don't need to be reminded to breathe, because we know how, we do it automatically. But the moment that we pause and do it deliberately, we are entering into the experience in a new way. And so I offer everybody to kind of do this, in a sense, to prepare ourselves, and this can be used in multiple circumstances. Just imagine just imagine first off that you're the storyteller and you have a story, you have something that you want to share with someone. One of the first things that you should do is slow yourself down. Practice that breathing and prepare yourself before you share that story with someone else. The other part, and this happens too, have you ever been invited over to a dinner, a cup of coffee, and you know that there's going to be a conversation that's going to happen? A way that you can prepare for that is to breathe. Is to put yourself in a space where you're going to be willing to receive. And this next part, I think, is incredibly important. There's this great sociologist that I've been doing a lot of kind of research with and study on, Arthur Frank, and his definition of empathy is this: to take seriously what someone else takes seriously. To take seriously what someone else takes seriously. And the reason why I love that is because it, first and foremost, it doesn't say that you have to first off understand what the other person is going through, right? That's the thing we don't want to fall into the trap of, is saying, "Oh, I understand." And now, oftentimes this gets used in questions about especially at the hospital, questions about illnesses, questions about end of life, all these kind of different things. I work with a support group that's connected with bereavement and whatnot. And so we're always very careful of saying, we don't want to say, "Oh, I understand what you're going through," because grief is unique and things like that. But I was talking with my wife, Nicole, and we were kind of talking about this, and I almost was going to get her up. So she pretended as it, and this is not a derogatory remark to any teenage girls. I've got 3 girls, they're going to be teenage girls someday. But she went and she was going on, and she was like, "Well, so I was at school, and Susie was saying that she was friends with Billy, and I couldn't believe because Billy was wearing those shoes." And she just went into this and was cracking up. But what it reminded me of is, because particularly whether you have children, grandchildren, whether you're with other people whose world might be totally different than yours, but we can dare to take seriously what they take seriously. And that silly example, it's saying that within that school framework, whatever is going on with the students, whatever they kind of bring home, that is what they are taking seriously. And so if you can dare to take that seriously, you don't have to fix it. You don't even have to keep track of who every specific character is. But if you can listen and then say, "Wow, there's something deeper than just trying to figure out the narration going on," that's how you show empathy. That's how you are open to that experience. And in and of itself, that tool can really assist relationships. And ultimately, that's what we want when we're around the table. Some of my best and finest memories of sitting around the table aren't just connected with the great food, but it's saying, "Wow, I really felt heard at that meal." And wow, I was really able to kind of be in a place where I was able to hear somebody else. Those are the ones that really, really make me mindful of how important and how interconnected we are, no matter how isolated we might feel. And so I would always say that when we're talking about this sense of empathy, that if we're willing to do that and we're willing to listen in that way, we're always going to be on the mark. We're always going to be on the mark because we have taken a moment and not just worried ourselves about us, but we're really entering into somebody else's experience. And it doesn't take any classes as a therapist or as a counselor. it's that innate ability that we can have, but it's like anything else. It needs to be practiced. I saw there was a question on the board.
Yeah, so this is a question from Anne. She wants to know, how do you listen and allow a story to become sacred if they are blaming others? Is that helpful to the teller? How to stop judging that?
There's a whole field of therapy that centers on, first and foremost, non-blaming. And the idea is that if we're talking about, let's say somebody is talking about something that's a problem, that we are saying the person is not the problem. The problem is the problem. The problem is the problem. So whether you're, let's say people are looking at finances, and they're looking at the finances and they want to blame somebody. That doesn't involve sacredness. Instead, you say, okay, let's look at the problem. Maybe the TV line is just the facts, man, just the facts. In that sense that you just want to look at what the problem is and not blame the person. And the reasoning is not that, well, it's just mean to blame people. It's not just that. It's trying to say that if we enter into a non-blaming relationship, that it's actually going to be more advantageous. And we're going to get to the place we wanted to get in the first place probably quicker. And so by saying something is sacred, what we are saying is that it is more important than normal things. That's all we're kind of saying. It's not saying that there's not sacredness in all things. It's not that. It's saying that we want to put extra importance in this. And that's why when we talk about a meal, we know almost innately that meals have different hierarchies at different times during the day, at different times in our lives. And so that's why it's okay to say, well, it's not saying that this meal is not important. Yes, no, that meal got you maybe to the next meal, but there are certain meals that lend themselves to an even deeper sacredness. And what I'm trying to allow people to be open to is that we don't always know when that's going to happen. So it might just be that if you have children and they're coming from after school, that might be a need for a sacred moment because of something that needs to be listened to, and to practice that empathy. Hopefully, does that make sense, Emily?
Yeah, I think that was great. Was there another question, Alita?
I wasn't sure if there was a second question, Alita.
Yeah, Alita, I think you may be muted.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Keep on forgetting about that little button, right? So we read the first question. So the second one was from Denise. I'm sorry. She was saying, thank you so much for saying all this, Paul. So many awesome reminders. And then Anne says, thank you.
Thank you, Alita. And Paul, I wanted to ask as well, just kind of piggybacking on Anne's question, in relationship to, often you get people who start sharing something and then they'll say, oh, but it's not a big deal. And, there's people in the world who don't have a roof over their heads and are starving, and et cetera, and all the woes and worries of the world. And I just wanted your perspective on how do you carve out space for someone like that?
Sure. And that's a beautiful insight. First and foremost, more often than not, a lot of the things that I'm doing them within a hospital setting. And somebody, I'll go and I'll visit somebody, and they'll start talking about, why maybe it's at the hospital and whatnot. And then sometimes they will say, oh, but, I'm fine. In fact, they'll be like, well, you might want to go, see somebody else because, I'm not that bad, kind of thing. And I always try to remind people, first and foremost, it's not a competition. And so your story is of grand importance, period. It's of grand importance, period. Now, again, this kind of lends itself back to the idea of looking at things maybe with more intentionality, that there are times in our lives where things are more mundane, sure. And yet there's a beautiful argument to be made that in the mundaneness of life, we often kind of find rich gems. There's no question there. But to lessen your story, when you say that to somebody, sometimes what you can be saying is that my story isn't that important because something else is more important. And those other things are still happening, but the reality is that your story is important. And one of the reasons why you should know it's important is because if you notice, in those cases, somebody's already shared something. So that's where the listener can quickly remind them, no, those other things are true. No, your story is important. Please, if you don't mind, I would love to hear more. That's a way in which to kind of encourage somebody, and because it can just be an automatic mechanism that some people will say because they don't want to feel that they're overburdening somebody. So by just inviting them and say, and this is the other part, where if you feel comfortable, if you're in a space where you feel comfortable, where you can just say, I think what you're sharing is incredibly important. Can we just take a moment to honor that? And that's when it goes back to that breathing exercise of literally just kind of breathing and then inviting the person to continue. If you do that, you'll find that now both parties are really, when you talk about being on the same page, are really on the same page. And it can be just a very beautiful and natural way, again, because it's connected to breathing, a natural way to connect. The other part of this is that these small techniques of, one, kind of entering into breathing, two, practicing this kind of empathy that allows a person to take seriously what someone else takes seriously, and listening in a way where you are honoring the person and their story, can allow people to have conversations that are otherwise very difficult to have. Because again, it points to this sense of the problem is the problem. The person's not the problem. And so you're entering a relationship with the person. You're not necessarily entering a relationship with the problem. And that's why we want to try this kind of stuff, because we are all so important. I mean, ultimately, isn't that what it is? We are all so important. We all literally need to be fed, and we all need to find some sort of table to be around. Again, I know folks on this call that are they live alone. Hey, that's a reality. How do you find your table? How do you find your table? One way is this, right? I mean, some people say, well, I don't get a chance to go out. I don't have a lot of family around, but yet they're talking to me. And I'll say, well, this is all right. This is the time then. This is the time. Whatever that place is, we need to find our table. We always need to find our table, because it's a sacred place where new experiences can occur, and this grand creativity can take place. And that's where empathy really happens. I really believe that.
So another question I have for you, Paul, is let's say someone is sharing something with you and you're kind of in that empathetic relating kind of state, and they just start to break down, and they're like sobbing and they're crying, or they just are breaking down. What's the best kind of approach for something like that?
Anytime we have a somatic response. Anytime we have an emotional response, it means something important is there. And so when we talk about honoring stories, we want to recognize that that an emotion is taking place. So first and foremost, we can pause because we're honoring the reaction. And it's very okay to say back to the person, but it seems to really kind of hit you hard. There's tears involved, there's sadness. Would you like to talk about that more? It goes back to that invitation. We would rather not pretend as if that didn't happen. And sometimes if people feel uncomfortable, then they can think, well, let's kind of pretend that didn't happen, that person didn't cry. Or we can even see if somebody's trying to hold something back. Mm-hmm. I always encourage people to invite. And if you don't feel comfortable with other people displaying emotions, think of it this way. Just to, again, it goes back to not solving the problems. Just invite people to have a space. Even if it's just being there, and just being there. You don't have to fix them. Just being there. One person was talking about resiliency and said a beautiful practice that they have and encourage is that when this person was talking about somebody that they were a couple, and when they would come home, whatever it was, they would allow the other person to kind of say what the day was and not have the other person think, how can they fix it? I thought that was kind of just a beautiful practice. So if somebody's having a response and let's say they're talking about the day and just kind of breaking down, let's first and foremost not say, okay, I got to hurry up and fix this. Be present in the moment. Allow that to happen. Honor that part of the story, because every time we have an emotional response, whether it's sadness or whether it's anger, if somebody has kind of our anger, it's a perfect opportunity. Whoa. Let's just breathe a moment. Let's just take a moment and then kind of go on from there.
Thank you. Alita, any questions from our audience?
Yeah, so there's actually a comment from Anne. So she says, so you can accept someone's beliefs as sacred to them because they, the person, are important.
That's a good, yeah, please.
That was it, sorry.
Yeah,
I was just saying it was.
That's a good, and again, it's trying to, again, we're not trying to be like a dualistic people that we're all kind of, separate from our bodies or anything like that. It's not that. It's trying to recognize that the person, the individual, is that important. I think they are so important that yes, and when we talk about a person's belief system and what gives them purpose, those things, we don't want to just think that they just are like clouds that just float around. No, they help kind of make up the person. And so that's part of it, that person is important. So when we're listening to them and we're talking about, and we are saying, wow, you really take that seriously. I'm going to take serious that you take that seriously. Doesn't mean that we're buying in to somebody else's belief system. It is saying that, wow, that is something that is incredibly important to you. And I'm going to show real, again, whatever language you want to use, real reverence for that, I'm going to honor that, I'm going to respect that. All those kinds of things are ways in which we allow that person a space where they can kind of continue to share in a positive, and again, it goes back to that non-blaming way. I think that's very important.
So Paul, how do we get sort of in touch with these spaces in our bodies where, we may be harboring some past experiences? How do we even begin to access something like that?
And it's first and foremost through discussion. Now, what will, through some sort of dialogue, what normally will happen is that this is directly connected with the sense of the body knows, is that it'll live somewhere in our body. So it could be that when we start thinking about the experience, maybe we get an upset stomach. and we don't feel good. Sometimes people will talk about holding stress in certain parts of their body. Maybe it's their shoulders, maybe it's their neck. Wherever you hold that stress will also be connected with the experience. And so that's why kind of talking through that and asking somebody, well, again, it kind of goes back to that emotional response. You hold that, you seem to be kind of clenched up. That's a perfect way to show, well, you're kind of still holding that stress when you talk about that past experience. So a lot of the times, people will literally hold stress in the same place for multiple experiences. And so it's good to be able to kind of pinpoint that, because as we pinpoint that, it's easier to work through. Again, the idea is not to get rid of, but to be able to work through, and being able to isolate where we hold our stress, how we experience our stress. And I'm saying stress in the sense of this past experience that comes to us again, whether it's through our retelling or through some sort of reliving or through maybe some sort of adjacent thing that happens that reminds us of something that had happened before. That feeling, at least we know that's a trigger, and that's a way in which we know that maybe that's the time to reach out so that we can work through, not get rid of, but work through.
Thank you. And that reminds me to touch upon this idea that, while the body houses these emotions, it can have long-term effects on us. So a very well demonstrated and studied kind of emotional and physical interaction is that of stress and inflammation. So people who are chronically stressed and are undergoing that, they often have high inflammatory markers in the blood. And we know more and more that inflammation, systemic inflammation, chronic inflammation over time can have long-term health consequences. So it really does start with what you're saying, Paul, with how are we going to manage these emotions? How are we going to talk through them? It's been a challenging, year and a half, 18 months or so. And what are you doing in your own homes, around your own tables, alone or with each other, to sit with that and to be with that and to acknowledge where it's impacting your body? And even I can even share, even talking about how it's been challenging, I can feel my throat. It tightens a little bit, right? So an example could be you put your hands on that body part, and I learned this from Paul's workshop, and just kind of breathe into that space, and immediately the tightness is gone. So it's really amazing how sensitive I think we all are, but we've kind of forgotten how to communicate with our own bodies in relationship to our emotional responses.
And the more we can do that on our own, and right, people talk about how do we start our day? What steps do we take? And so we find that the people who can practice some sort of resiliency, whether people come and they talk about looking at their day and say, okay, I'm going to bring these people to thought first thing in the morning because I'm looking forward to seeing these people. I'm going to, I got something that's going to be difficult today. All right, I'm going to take some time before. How do we prepare for those things? Each day will be ways in which we practice resiliency. And then doing that, we're going to be able to enter into those things with a greater sense of self. That's, I think, what we're trying to do. And then along the way also is feeding ourselves in a beautiful way, right? I mean, you've said how many times when we prepare our meals, they are much better for us than if we just have a meal. So that's, I think it's an interesting parallel.
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels between food and all of this kind of deep emotional work. I think they're tightly bonded. So I'm glad we could do this together. Alita, any other questions or comments from our audience?
Anne is just saying that it's amazing, chef, and thank you for sharing, and thank you, Paul. But no additional questions at this point.
Great. Thank you, Alita. And I guess, Paul, if someone wanted to practice this on their own, is there a way to kind of, work through something on your own that would hold space for yourself, I guess?
Sure. So, and there's, first and foremost, there's a lot of different ways in which I always invite persons to look at their own lives and see what things do you have in place. If you come from a religious background, are there certain religious practices that maybe you haven't done in a while? They say, wow, I could kind of maybe foster this again to help kind of prepare myself for the day. And I'll keep saying for the day because it is a day-to-day thing. The other part is, again, we know there's apps. There's plenty of apps, and I'm not against apps. I think they're all good, but don't be afraid to think about other real people in your lives and go, wow, this person has some of those qualities that I wish I could practice better, and to dare to get into dialogue with them. The reason I say that is because it is incredibly important to be able to practice self-resiliency, and a lot of that will be connected with breathing, with settling the self, with meditation, all these things. But we are made to be in relationships with others. And so that goes back to the sense of find our table. Make sure we always find our table. So I would encourage someone that if you don't have a practice of resiliency, if you don't have a practice of settling yourself, that to first and foremost, start with easy breathing. Secondly, seek out someone that at least that you're close to and have a relationship with, and be like, I want to at least ask them a dialogue about this, because if we're going to honor a story, we need to be able to have somebody else hear our story. That becomes very important. And remember that this is, in a beautiful way, can be adapted with various things and experienced throughout our lives. Where it's not just a one-time thing. It's like, wow, things are going fine. Now I need to practice resiliency in a new way because of something that's entered into our lives that's different than before.
That's a great reminder. And it kind of makes me think that the reason why we need to practice these things, right, is to continue to expand our window of tolerance of what we're able to manage and what we're able to deal with and have our emotional responses to. And the more that you practice these things, whether it's just simple breathing, the more you can kind of find, I couldn't have dealt with that 10 years ago, but now I can. And you can kind of see how the ways in which you've grown as a person. So I'm just going to take a moment because our class time is almost up, and I just want to show you everything that's coming out of the oven. It smells really, really good. So our vegetables are done. I added the wine while we were chatting. You can see they're nice, they're golden, and they smell really good. So you can just pop them into a bowl, kind of scrape them in. Make sure you get all the good stuff on the bottom too. And the tomatoes are going to kind of make like a juicy sauce for this. This is why I use parchment paper. I'll show you in a moment, because it's going to make it a lot easier to clean this tray. So you can see there's like a lot of char on the bottom there. So after that, you just want to add that little bit of white balsamic vinegar, just a sprinkle. Toss that together. If you wanted to add greens to this dish, you could grab a handful of arugula or fresh parsley and toss it on the hot vegetables or even spinach, and it'll wilt and get kind of folded in because the vegetables are so hot. So that's if you want to add some leafy greens. Every meal I always ask myself, how can I add something green to this? That's kind of my MO. And then our chicken looks really good as well. I'll show you what this looks like. So it's golden. It kind of formed like a beautiful crust, and it's bubbling. So this is also done. And you always just, try to serve yourself a nice looking plate because we eat with all of our senses. So there's a little tomato on the counter, but no one has to know about that, right? There we go. A little bit of cauliflower, onions, maybe a sprinkle of fresh parsley if you have it. Grab a piece of this gorgeous, gorgeous chicken and plate something nice up for yourself, right? So you can kind of settle into the feast for the eyes. So any final questions or comments? It is 6:30, so I want to honor everybody's time this evening.
Sure, quickly. So there's a comment from E. She says, a family member somehow always brings up mortality and longevity at meal gatherings. Even though they always want to have a happy meal, that's not very uplifting conversation. That's her comment. And then Denise says, wow, this explains why I gravitate toward being in the kitchen, even though my family hasn't had a family table for many years. I make lots of Emily's recipes and share with people I care about who I know will appreciate it. These are the people I would definitely want to have at my table. There was a question about cooking. It says, still difficult to clean those trays. Any advice? Always feels sticky and never totally cleaned.
Never totally cleaned. Well, the parchment paper really does help. And if you're not using that trick, good elbow grease. You just got to keep scrubbing at it. I use dish soap, and I use one of these, little wire, like the steel wool cleaners. They're these like stainless steel scrubbers, and you just have to keep scrubbing at it. It just takes a lot of, it's good for the arms. Yeah.
And then Tina saying, dear Emily and Paul, thank you for feeding our bodies as well as our souls. Miss you both.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So Paul, we have more classes coming up next week. We don't have the October calendar out to everybody yet, but it is coming. We're going to be doing a rustic Sicilian feast on Tuesday, and then we're having a class all about apples on Thursday. So come on back for those. And Paul, any final closing comments?
Yeah, just if somebody was talking about mortality, take them aside. Ask them why they always kind of come up. Dare to take kind of seriously what they're taking seriously. And then remind people too that more often than not, we can do a lot of beautiful work, especially in the fall time, if we think about being literally out in the apple orchard. It can be a great kind of metaphor during this time of year of where we want to be when we're trying to think about our own difficulties.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. It's always such a pleasure and honor to share this kitchen space with you. And thank you for sharing all of your wisdom and teachings with everybody this evening in our community. Have a wonderful evening. hope to see you all again very soon. And thank you, Alita, as always, for being our fabulous moderator.
Anytime.
Bye, everyone. Take care of yourselves.